If anyone notices a slight dripping here, the theater has developed a leak, so don't get excited. And if you hear louder noises, it's simply the ceiling coming down, so don't be disturbed. This morning we have what seems to me to be a very interesting subject. Because after all, as Socrates so well pointed out, the proper study for mankind is man. We have wonderful historical records of world-famous people in our own European culture. But as we go into more distant regions, our records are very inadequate. And there have been many highly interesting and important persons about whom we know comparatively little. And as many of these persons were within the field of our general interest, it seems to me that we should know more about them. Probably most of us have read the story of Anna and the King of Siam, or have seen the stage play or the motion picture versions, either under the original title or under the title The King and I. When I saw Mr. Yul Brunner do this role recently, it impressed me as being a most fascinating and dramatic subject, and I strongly suspected that the depths of it had not been thoroughly explored in the motion picture. This might be taken for granted. Also, after the film was released, there were complications in connection with its exhibition in Siam, or as they prefer to call themselves today, Thailand. These complications finally resulted in the prohibition of the picture in that country. Now, these people enjoy motion pictures as well as anyone else. And the only possible answer was that the film in some way was contrary to their estimation of the proprieties involved or of the king's proper character. We can allow something also, of course, for the belief that even if His Majesty did have certain faults, the government might not wish to have these publicly exhibited. Actually, however, I think our story goes back quite a way, and the same situation apparently is still influencing the authorities of Thailand that influenced them over 100 years ago. So with a few brief thoughts of this kind, we'd like to explore a little bit into the history and story of a really interesting and purposeful man who not only left an important message to his own people, but to a large degree contributed something to the better understanding of life, which we are all seeking. For of all the rulers, perhaps, of Asia in recent times, there was none who was a greater truth seeker than this bizarre King of Siam. In order to get ourselves historically oriented in a brief period, for we must understand that this story is really a very involved and profound one. I would merely like to add that a few months ago, I was fortunate enough to acquire an entire group of original manuscripts and papers relating to this important period in Siam. These papers include complete letters in the autograph of the king. Also, letters in the autographs of important missionaries who were functioning in Siam at that time, many of whom were close to the king and his confidential friends. Also included are a number of proclamations which seemingly have important bearing upon this critical period in the history of an Asiatic nation. Among these proclamations is the one changing the currency of Siam from cowrie shells to ordinary coinage. Perhaps more important, however, is the king's proclamation forbidding the use of opium. A proclamation which, as Sir John Bowring, who was the British minister at the court of Siam at that time, that this proclamation, given in the best of faith by the king, and for a real and urgent reason, failed somewhat, not because of the king, but because of the interference of foreign powers. In other words, foreign nations wanted the Siamese people to smoke opium, but the king of Siam did not. The head-on collision of this and many other important factors will be found in these missionary papers. Furthermore, we gain some insight into the medical work of the missionaries in Siam and the effort to introduce vaccination, at that time apparently greatly needed, or at least supposed to be necessary. The sincerity of the doctors in this situation cannot be questioned. The way that was used at that time was to dip the vaccine in a cloth, cut a wound in the arm of the person, and sew the cloth in. Dr. Bradley, who was one of the leaders in this effort, declared that they were getting from 70 to 80% efficiency by this method. So we have all kinds of interesting things involved in our story of Siam. First, a wee bit of historical orientation behind the subject of the morning. Siam, now Thailand, meaning the land of the brave, is a country about the size of France. It is located in southeastern Asia, directly north of that group of small independent or semi-independent principalities now known as the Federated Malay States. Siam is a country that is roughly bounded on the east and west by ranges of high mountains, and through the middle of this country, running in a southerly direction from its northern source, is a great river which at the time of these papers was known as the Minan. Later its name was changed to a name difficult to pronounce in Siamese, and I may point out at this time that my Siamese accent is definitely southern. In other words, undoubtedly unrecognizable. But I think we can get the facts across. The Minan is a river which, for Siam, was very much like the Nile in Egypt. The inundations of the Minan made this great alluvial area highly fertile, and also protected the rice crop, which was highly important to the survival of the nation economically and physically. In ancient times, the capital of Siam was way inland, and it was a mysterious and involved city called Ayutthaya. And this city, about the year 1767, was destroyed by a Burmese army. They came in, pillaged the city, destroyed it, and put most of the inhabitants to the sword. This Burmese invasion, however, was short-lived. The Siamese people rose almost immediately in a great revolution against the invading power and moved their capital to the city of Bangkok, which is located on the Minan and has a magnificent view. The city is also surrounded by canals which cut through it in various places, and its location and general description has caused it to be referred to as the Venice of Asia. The city is also remarkable for its magnificent spired temples called Wats, and these temples are, of course, dedicated to the prevailing religion of the region, Buddhism. With the moving of the capital to Bangkok, a new dynasty of Siamese kings came into existence. These kings took the reign names of Ramas, and we had Rama the first, Rama the second, and so on. This is so-called the fourth great dynasty upon the throne of Siam, and it began, as we say, with the moving of the capital to Bangkok. The first of these kings, a rather powerful and brilliant leader who assisted to liberate his people from the tragic wars with Burma, was succeeded also by a comparatively strong man and a comparatively brilliant man who died about the year 1824. Upon his death, he left or nominated for succession two of his sons, both by the same mother, for the country was polygamous, as were so many Asiatic countries at that time. These two sons were evidently, according to the king, most suitable to succeed. Actually, in Siam, the elder son did not necessarily succeed to the throne. The previous monarch had the right to elect, and in most instances he elected what he regarded to be the person most suitable for the throne. Now the question may arise why he elected two sons. This brings into focus a peculiar phase of Siamese government at that time. That is, that Siam was ruled simultaneously by two kings, and was therefore called a duarchy. This could only have succeeded in a nation temperamentally, more or less abstractly mystical and Buddhistic. Had this polarity of government existed elsewhere, it most certainly would have led to serious political complications and the desperate effort of one king to overthrow the other. In Siam, however, this did not occur, and the situation unfolded admirably. The two kings ruling at the same time were referred to as the first king and the second king, and this should not be regarded as a chronological definition. One did not precede the other in time. They ruled concurrently, but one preceded the other in certain authorities. The first king of Siam, who was sometimes simply referred to as the first king, held 2/3 of the income of the state, also was entitled to bear the title Rama, and was usually the more prominent political leader. He was the one to whom the exterior nations most often appealed and applied for permissions and privileges. This is true in the case of the man we are discussing, because he was not only the first king by right, but also, obviously, the first king by attainment, and therefore had a very strong position in the state. The second king, his younger brother, was also a brilliant man, of great literary activity and interest, especially fond of Western sciences, particularly navigation. He was quite a remarkable and cultured man, and an American traveler visiting him in the middle of the last century went into the palace of the second king to find there in this remote area a bust over the bookcase of Sir Walter Scott, and the entire writings of Scott's in fine edition below. The second king also was quite an expert on English dictionaries, had 11 different ones, which he compared to determine the best usage of words. And here in the midst of this jungle, this man, as expressed, with a silken cloth wrapped around his waist, his lower legs bare, his toes slipped into pointed slippers, and a loose jacket of gold and brocade on his upper body, and a small skull cap surmounting the entire picture, in this wonderful and remote place, leaned over to his visitor, holding in one hand a solid silver teapot, and turning to the visiting officer from the United States, calmly remarked as he poured, "Cream and sugar." This was a situation that was hard to imagine in so remote and unconventional an area. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the second king, and as we may not get back to him, perhaps we better mention it here, is that he was a great student of the life of George Washington. And when Captain, later Admiral Foote, visited him, the Admiral tried to discover for his own satisfaction whether this was merely hero worship or a solid knowledge. And he admitted afterwards that the second king of Siam knew more about George Washington than he did, as an American student of history and himself a member of the armed forces. The height of the second king's interest is to be expressed by the fact that he named his son George Washington. And believe it or not, His Royal Highness George Washington became King of Siam. So that this might seem strange in the history book, but it actually happened. And George Washington ruled as second King of Siam to around 1880. With this background, we must return to the death of the second Rama of Siam, which took place about 1824. He had nominated his son, Prince Mongkut, to be the first king of Siam. The young man at that time was about 20 years old, and he had a half-brother, then about 37 years old, who had been a very successful militarist and statesman, who had become, so to say, the head of the armies, and exercised considerable political influence. Because of the youth of Prince Mongkut, and also because of the ambitions of this half-brother, who is referred to in some of the accounts as the illegitimate heir to the throne, the half-brother stepped in and practically by force took the throne and was duly crowned as Rama III. There are several explanations, some of which would indicate that the half-brother was a typical dictatorial person, rather ruthless, and others that combining his influence with that of the nobles and of the Council of State, it was the mature opinion of all that the country needed at that time a rather strong militarist, and under that definition, Prince Mongkut would not possibly qualify. In any event, the appointed or elected heir to the throne was bypassed by the country, and Prince Mongkut and his brother were not given the succession that they had expected. In this emergency, the two men came to decision as to career. The younger brother decided that as long as his elder brother lived, his own life was comparatively secure. It was unlikely that he would come into any serious difficulties. So he chose to enter political life, and in due time became the second king under the usurper. The older brother, who should have been the first king, Prince Mongkut, did a very unusual thing for the royalty of his country. He resigned from all of his temporal powers and privileges and entered the priesthood. So our King of Siam, as portrayed by Mr. Yul Brunner, was for 25 years a Buddhist monk. This was an interesting and important phase of his life. He was driven to it by one of two considerations, we are told. First, that he did not feel it wise, as long as he was the appointed heir to his father, to endanger the solidarity of the country by entering into a political career. He could have been very near to the crown. He could have been prime minister or one of the highest officers of the state. Had he done so, however, it might have caused great uneasiness to the usurper king, who would always fear that there would be an uprising against him in favor of the lawful heir. This in turn might lead to complications and even conspiracy and assassination. Mongkut did not want anything of this nature to occur. Also, by his own inclinations, he was of the most scholarly nature, and he seems to have felt that it was most useful to his own life that he become a scholar and a learned man. He had already dimly glimpsed, even within his nation, the rising force of exterior circumstances, the coming of other nations and of political, commercial treaties and matters of importance. He felt the need, as did his younger brother, to gain some insight into the Western worlds with which Siam must ultimately come in direct contact. The life of Maha Mongkut in the religious world was interesting and pointed. The King of Siam at that time, Rama III, was so surrounded by protocol that he was virtually a prisoner in his own palace. He had great honors and great temporal authority, but he was within a medieval structure as fantastic as that of the Arabian Nights. There were many things he could not do without going against the entire traditional background of the Siamese dynasty. Rather than face all these confusions and probably undermine the stability of his own government, Rama III simply continued in the old way. But he did make two important concessions, which indicate that his own mind was not closed to the importance of Western contact. First of all, he did permit a trade treaty with Great Britain. And second, he did admit missionaries into Siam. And in a moment we'll come to this very interesting missionary situation. At the moment, however, Rama III is ruling, and Prince Mongkut is in a monastery. In this monastery, the prince had no problem of protocol at all. Under the Siamese system of Buddhism, he was a completely free man. He could go and come as he pleased. He could visit wherever he pleased. And he spent a great deal of his time visiting in the homes of the missionaries. He also invited them to his temple. And he made a very interesting arrangement with one of the missionaries, the Reverend John Caswell. He permitted the Reverend Caswell to come to his temple, that where he lived, the Buddhist house of retreat, and there teach him the English language. And in exchange for teaching the prince English, the prince permitted the missionary to distribute religious tracts on the steps of the Buddhist temple. It was quite an interesting and unusual situation that becomes psychologically more delightful as we proceed. During the course of his many years in the monastery, Mongkut reached out continuously for Western ideas. At that time, there were two groups of missionaries, one Catholic and the other Protestant. The principal Catholic missionary of importance was Bishop Palago, and this man was the apostolic vicar to Siam. The Roman Church had been permitted to reopen its missions because earlier, through the French and the Portuguese, the Church had become involved in political dissensions in Siam and had been more or less forbidden to function. But under Rama III, the old and kindly bishop was brought back. It was this bishop who taught Prince Mongkut Latin. And while the king's Latin was a unique kind of language all in itself, with a faint reminiscence to Latin, but with a strong Siamese accent, both in speaking and in grammar. The king, through this contact with the Latin languages, became capable of reading a great many classical works, otherwise not available to him. He also studied very carefully all of the structure of the Roman Church, all its rituals and ceremonies, its rites and its history, and became a prodigious authority on these matters. His affection and regard for the old bishop were so real that later, when the bishop died, Mongkut assisted in the funeral ceremony, and the missionaries gave him, as a testimony of their regards, the old amethyst ring which the bishop had worn. In any way we wish to look at it, Mongkut was not too long in the monastery before he began to realize the importance of reorganizing and reforming Siamese Buddhism. At that time, as he himself explained it, the original teachings of Gautama, the Indian Buddha, had passed through so many miles of jungle and so many centuries of interpretation that it had lost much of its original purity. It had become encrusted with legendary and lore, with myth and fable, and with interpretation upon interpretation, including many doubtful interpretations by Siamese monks who were not really themselves scholars, though intensely devout. The effort to clear this situation caused Mongkut, as a monk, to lay a broad program for the reforming of the religion. So successful was this religion that the prince rose very high in the Buddhist hierarchy himself and finally attained to the position of the Grand Abbot of Siam. He became the head of Siamese Buddhism. In this strategic position, and backed as he was by the nobility of his birth, he had a comparatively free hand, and he began to strip away what he regarded as all of the superstitions that had gathered upon Buddhism. He divided Buddhism into two essential groupings or structures. The first he called ethical-cultural, and he declared that the great strength of Buddhism lay in its moral influence, its commandments, its control and direction of the character of persons, its admonitions of right and wrong, and its emphasis upon virtues and integrities. These the prince held to be absolutely necessary to the continuance of the good work of the faith among his people. Second to this was the theological structure, consisting of ancient myths, cosmogonic myths, stories about celestial beings, heavens and hells, purgatories, and a weird form of Buddhistic astronomy which had arisen in Burma and in other areas and had gradually drifted into Siam, perhaps through the old civilization of the Khmers. To Prince, or to the very reverend and venerable Maha Mongkut, this incrustation had to go. And in order to achieve his purposes, he joined with the missionaries, both Protestant and Catholic, in a review, as far as he was able to attain it, of Western science. He became strongly attached to the astronomical writings of Galileo and Copernicus. He also gained a considerable skill in astronomy himself and wrote a 46-page dissertation in English in which he set forth his own special shortcut methods for the calculation of solar and lunar eclipses. He was really a serious man in his own field. What he did to Buddhism, of course, was a very simple thing. He took the moralism, the ethics, the spiritual integrity of Buddhism, and combined it with Western science. He would permit no universe for the Buddhists that was not consistent with Galileo and Copernicus. He demanded the recognition of biology, physics, and modern astronomy in the understanding of the operations of universal law. He did not touch the morals or the ethics. He held firmly to the spiritual convictions of rebirth and karma, but he said that these were perfectly compatible with good scientific procedure based upon modern educational methods. All this time he was wandering around, much as depicted by Mr. Yul Brunner, in his jewel jacket, his bandy legs, and his golden-toed slippers. The situation was quite incongruous, but very vital for the people. Later writers have estimated this situation and have said that all Siamese Buddhism, subsequent to the time of Mongkut, has been influenced by him, that he was the greatest religious reformer his country had ever known, and that he was entitled to be regarded as the Martin Luther of Siam, the great reformer, the man who declared that it was necessary for religion to overcome conflict with modern knowledge by simply accepting this knowledge where it was correct and having no controversy over it whatsoever, assuming that the true sphere of religion was moral and ethical, and that as such it must keep pace with the changing physical knowledge of mankind. This is all the more interesting as the prince himself was in the midst of a very changing situation, in which his own country was moving from a fantastic barbarism toward what might be termed modern civilization. While the king was in the monastery for 25 years, it is also notable that his own personal character and morality have been most stoutly and strongly defended, not only by Siamese writers, but by all English and European writers and Americans who had personal knowledge of him during this time. Before he entered the Buddhist orders, Mongkut had been married and had children. For the 25 years that he was in the monastery, he remained completely celibate, setting an excellent example to other monks and religious people, and pointing out to the state that it was not the purpose of religion to interfere with the state, but to inspire the state to the highest fulfillment of its own moral and ethical duties. While the prince was therefore hard at work in his various reforms and activities, the usurper king, Rama III, died. And in 1850, the throne was again vacant. Rama III had nominated his own successors from his family. But now once more, the Prime Minister, the Council of State, and the nobles intervened. This time they intervened in favor of Prince Mongkut. And in 1850 he was called to the throne, and his younger brother was also fully established in his authorities. And Prince Mongkut was brought to the throne as Rama IV, King of Siam. For a moment, there was a considerable amount of suspense as to what would occur to a country when a man who had been a monk for 25 years was suddenly raised to temporal power. The misgivings, however, seemingly were without foundation. For having reached this authority, Maha became an outstanding example of diplomatic leadership. Now, at this time, we should perhaps pause a little and try to create a picture of the king in order that we may reconcile his life with the accounts by Margaret Langdon and also by the stories brought over by Mrs. Anna Leon Owens, who was the governess to the palace children and part-time secretary to the king for a few years. These stories and the accounts of Sir John Boring and the American first consul general to Siam, the British consulates, and a little later, the German consulates of the Hanseatic League. All of these should give us, together with a few personal recollections and reminiscences from earlier writers, a fair picture of the king himself and what he stood for. The description or portrayal of him by Yul Brynner is not inaccurate. It is somewhat superficial, but it presents to us much the character of the man himself. He has been estimated in 100 ways, but the final estimation must be upon the achievements which he attained and accomplished. He is described by Boring, who knew him perhaps as well as anyone, and by Dr. Dan Bradley, the Congregationalist missionary who was his personal friend for nearly a lifetime, in rather glowing, but we'll say qualified terms. First of all, we must realize that nearly every opinion of him that we have comes from non-Buddhist sources, mostly from the Christian missionaries or Christian officials of other nations, many of whom were quite personally devout, and as the period of our interest lies from 1850 to 1868, we know that the missionary fervor was strong at that time, and that a very difficult situation arose. Perhaps we must make a certain detour here to clear this before we can go on. In 1835, the Reverend Dan Bradley, M.D., a homeopathic physician, and a member of a missionary association which later became involved with the Congregationalist movement, went to Siam with his family. Even before he had settled there, he lost one child to the climate and misery of that then comparatively isolated region. The trip to Siam in those days was an almost incredible one. Letters took 6, 8, and 9 months to be delivered. It was like going out of the only world you knew. And these missionaries were very devout, sincere persons, striving desperately to accomplish a job which they felt to be necessary. While they did not succeed in their primary objective, their secondary success was enormous. Bradley we'll use as symbolic of most of the others. As years went on, he was only out of Siam 2 or 3 years of his entire mature life. And his children also grew up close to the life of the Siamese people. Bradley was a tall, slender man, and as he grew older, he had a very venerable white beard and looked like a typical family patriarch of the middle 19th century. He was a good man, sincere, God-loving and God-fearing. And he had not been there very long before he became quite associated with Mongkut. Of course, at this time, the king was then a monk in his temple. Many of these men, including the Catholic bishop, grew more and more personally fond of this very interesting monk as he was then. They knew he was a prince. There was no reason to suppose then that he would ever be king. But as they describe it themselves, here was a man stepping out from behind a lacquered screen, a man whose body was covered with the most barbaric ornaments, a man whose personality was flamboyant in the extreme, with much of the attitude and the background of Al-Rashid the Magnificent. And yet a man who came to their homes, sat humbly at their feet, and begged, almost with tears in his eyes, for knowledge. He wanted knowledge. He wanted to know. He wanted to learn. He wanted to understand what lay beyond the mouth of the Minan, out south into Singapore and Hong Kong. He wanted to know who was what in Europe, in the United States. And even before he was king, he had pictures of every president of the United States up to Andrew Jackson. He tried to understand what democracy meant, what liberty meant, what these various nations were attempting to do. Later, of course, there's the delightful story of his offering Siamese elephants to Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln's declining them on the grounds that the climate wasn't suitable for elephant herds in the United States, and probably they would have to continue to use trains and boats and things like that for transportation. But this shows two things: the interest of the king and his complete naivete as far as understanding. On the other side of the story is the magnificent letter that he wrote to Queen Victoria on the occasion of the death of Prince Albert. And in this letter, as a devout Buddhist, he tried to give the Queen Empress the advantage of a spiritual consolation, an understanding in her great tragedy. The man reached out into every part of the world that he could reach, and yet he was bound by the most impossible traditions and the most limited facilities. One of the members of the American ship's crew, an officer who visited there in 1855 and was present with Captain Foote at a special soiree given by the first king of Siam, described his own impressions of him. He said, "This man is unbelievable. In the first place, if a Chinese should say that there was anything that a Chinese could learn, the Great Wall of China would crumble. All of these remote countries are peopled by individuals who feel themselves to be completely self-sufficient. Here is an absolute monarch whose subjects do not dare to approach him except crawling on the ground. Here is a man who has everything that he wants and absolute power over life and death. And yet this man steps down from his throne, holds out his hand to some merchant or missionary, and says, I am a barbarian, and I want my people to be civilized. And this officer said, a man as thirsty for knowledge, as willing to admit his own ignorance, as desperately seeking to understand. For a man like this to become the ruler of a backward country means a tremendous thing for that country. It means a continuous emphasis upon improvement. If, however, the king lacked Western intellectualism, he did not lack native intelligence. He was one of the most intelligent men of his time. And the missionaries learned this to their dismay. In their early contact with him, he had shown so great an interest in their thinking and in their various ideas that they came finally to hope very strongly that he would be converted to Christianity. As he saw this situation arising, he went to them and he sat quietly with them and he said, Gentlemen, this is not possible. I was born, I have lived, and I will die a Buddhist. But this does not mean that I have any less sympathy for you and what you are trying to do. He said, it is perfectly all right. I will be completely happy if you convert the entire kingdom. It does not worry me in the slightest. But he said, Gentlemen, I don't think you can do it. The reason why I don't think you can do it is because your religion, when compared to our religion, is too similar to create the necessary contrasts which cause people to become moved from one faith to another. He said, our Buddhist scripture says, thou shalt not take life. Your religion says, thou shalt not kill. These differences are not great enough to move a people. We are already practicing practically every virtue you practice. Therefore, the only thing you could give us is your theology. And he said, I question very much whether our people are interested as to whether it is your theology or our theology that is taught from our temples. I don't believe you can stir them into any great amount of excitement over this situation. On another occasion, he talked with Dr. Bradley, and he said to him very simply, he said, Dr. Bradley, you have been here nearly 20 years. You are a devout man, and you are one of my nearest friends and one of the most valued men in my kingdom. And he said, you have worked unceasingly, you have suffered, you have gone through great privation. Your family has suffered. Your children have died for the courage you have brought here. He said, my heart aches for you. For in this period of time, you probably have not made 5 actual converts among the people of Thai. You have converted a number of Chinese, because Chinese is the second population in Siam or Thailand. But he said, this I will tell you. If you can convert, even among the Chinese and Thailanders, a sufficient number to make it politically possible, I will give them a province of their own. I will place a Christian governor over them and will give them complete autonomy within my empire, guaranteeing them complete freedom from all persecution or religious intolerance, and permit them to rule themselves by their own laws. He said, I am not against you. But he said, I do not believe that this thing can be done. I do not believe it can be done because the roots of our religion are the roots of our education, the roots of our statescraft, the roots of our government. And the average person is not that concerned about the name of the thing he worships. He is concerned with the substance of it. And he said the substance of our two faiths, whether we realize it or not, are too much alike to create any kind of a ground for conversion. The missionaries were also limited by the fact that they had no real persecution, with the exception of a few unfortunate episodes, which were largely of a minor nature. The missions in Siam had only the climate, the weather, and the times to limit them. They were not subject to any unreasonable persecution. At various times, however, King Mongkut, who read all of the English press very carefully, the newspapers, found that a great many unfavorable stories ridiculing Siam, or ridiculing his religion, or depreciating it, or making fun of things, appeared in the English and American presses. Because the missionaries were about the only non-Siamese or non-Thailand people in the region, he became concerned because he feared that the missionaries were sending these unfavorable reports out. Whenever a series of these reports appeared, he would therefore mildly slap the missionaries. He would take some privilege from them or call them up, make them explain their situation. He was pouting and unhappy over it for a few weeks, then promptly forgave everybody and things went on as before. But I think the trouble with the present motion picture is rooted in the same thing. That it is not felt that it has told fairly the story of a really important person. And we might feel the same way if the King of Siam picture had been created around Abraham Lincoln, who suddenly breaks into song and dance in the second act. We might feel the same way about that if it was done in Thailand. These situations are not fortunate, but the king knew them in his own day and admitted them as such. Among other interesting aspects of his nature was his real and genuine fondness for Western manners and customs. When he entertained a group of American representatives, he gave for them a performance within his palace of music, dance, and a splendid banquet on solid gold plate, much as symbolized in the motion picture. As one of the officers reported afterwards, he said it was an evening out of this world. It was a beautiful, touching, wonderful exhibition, in every sense of the word, absolutely proper. Nothing that anyone could take offense at. High art and fine artistry, and an atmosphere that seemed to take you into the medieval world. He said when it was all over, he said we were just drifting around in a kind of glamorous mystery world with the air around us filled with sparkling fireflies and other interesting things. They gathered the fireflies into nets, put them in their hair, and you could see these fireflies shining in the night. It was a very beautiful spectacle. After it was all over and these officers in full military uniform were making their bows and clicking their heels, King Mongkut suddenly stood up and said, "Gentlemen, would you do me a favor?" They said, "Of course, if we can." Well, he says, "Give me 3 Western cheers." Well, this was almost too much, but finally the captain of the ship led in the lustiest cheers they could work up at the moment. And it broke the spell. It was just like, as one of them said, the bellowing of a bull in fairyland. But at the same time, the king was absolutely tickled to death. Now, Sir John Bowring, who had to work with the king as minister plenipotentiary to the court of Victoria, and who later became governor of Hong Kong, gives us some other rather interesting understanding. He said, this man, this barbarian, this man who can look at you and smile like a child and can stage a perfect temper fit any time he wants it, but always gets over it just at the right moment, never goes beyond a certain point with it, and has his emotional exuberance under the most immediate control. He said, do not deceive yourself. This man is a power to conjure with. Boring and several others worked with Mongkut for years, trying to get certain concessions they wanted. He was always the wandering child, always asking their advice, always leaning heavily upon them, always agreeing definitely of the importance of these matters, solicitous, considerate, generous of his time and energy, and always doing exactly as he pleased. They could do nothing with him. He was a strange kind of child, and when the argument reached a certain point, he was impossible to cope with, for the simple reason that he simply told the truth. And this practically collapsed international diplomacy in the area for nearly 20 years. Also, by means of this situation, as one authority points out, Mongkut caught on to a very tricky and subtle point. He knew the West was moving in. There was nothing he could do to prevent it, and he really did not want to prevent it. But he said to himself, how shall this happen? Shall I sit behind my palace walls, close my eyes, and do nothing until the storm breaks over me, and the entire government and perhaps my entire country are swept away? Or shall I create a dam and put into this dam flood controls, gates, where I can open and let a little water through, and open it over here and let a little water through, so that the country is never flooded? And this is exactly what he proceeded to do. He permitted a stream of Western influence, which he himself controlled and directed, to move in gradually under his supervision, so that there was never a moment when there was an impact between East and West in his country. They were always ready for the next move. There was never a time when it was necessary to move in an army. There was never a revolt, never an excuse for a head-on disagreement between Siam and any other nation. Everything had been prepared. Every path had been strewn with flowers. And anyone who tried to break in would have immediately appeared to be a heartless ruffian, because there was no need for it. By means of this procedure, Mongkut was able to preserve the independence of his country. And he was the only nation in Southeast Asia that did not fall to the British, to the French, to the Dutch, to the Portuguese, or to somebody. He retained his autonomy and prepared the way for a powerful country to come. Other nations, hiding behind their medievalism, stood as long as they could and then fell. He never hid himself this way, therefore he never fell. He was continuously growing and preparing, and among his people he is regarded as a bridge between the old and the new, a man in a fantastic position, with one foot on the absolute sovereignty of medievalism and his other foot on the Western world and Western progress. And in his own personality, he bridged these things. And he bridged them largely by the application of his religious philosophy, having united Buddhism and science. He saw in this an archetypal pattern for the bridging of East-West in everything. that these things could meet as compatible and not as deadly strangers coming on with a tremendous impact. In the advancement of these ideas, for example, he personally approached the wives of several of the Protestant missionaries in Siam. And as early as 1851 and 52, when he had only recently reached the throne, he appointed these wives as the instructors of the women of his palace. The story of Anna Leon Owens does not stand unique, inasmuch as she came considerably later, and she was not the first European woman to teach in the palace of the king. The first composed of the wives of these missionaries, and they for nearly 4 years went twice a week into the women's quarter of the palace, and there they taught. And it might also be at point to mention the fact that the women's quarter of the royal palace of the first king of Siam was not a harem. It was actually the home of practically all of the female members of the royal family. The head of the household and also head of the palace guard of soldiers was an ancient maiden aunt of the king, and she ruled the entire situation with a rod of iron. There was never a better drum major than the aunt of the ruling monarch. Here were gathered important members of the family, as you realize the numerous relatives and relationships of such Oriental monarchs could well number 600. And the palace was therefore not only his home, but actually the state residence for princes of many degrees, important leaders in all branches of government, the families of outstanding leading officers of the military and the state. So it was quite a massive establishment. And to this establishment, the king sent these wives of the missionaries. And he said, I want you to teach them, his family, English. I want you to teach them to read and to write. I want you to teach them useful arts and sciences. But he says, I do not wish you to teach them theology. But he said, this I will permit. If you are of the right mind, if you do not attempt to force the conversion of my people, if you do not over-influence them, I will permit you each week to gather them all together and read to them the New Testament. But he said, I do not wish you to frighten them or insist that they will be damned if they do not believe this. You may present it, but you may not force it. So these people for 4 years very faithfully and wonderfully instructed the family of the king, who got great joy and pleasure out of having letters written to him by his maiden aunt in English, although she lived only 50 feet down the corridor. It became part of his reaching out into a world of new knowledge. The attitudes of the king concerning language are among the most delightful and amusing. But we do feel also that they represent to us this man who had, at times, quite a violent temper, but had it so wonderfully and strategically timed. He always had the temper when it would accomplish something. And he got over it with the ease of a small child. He never held a grudge against anyone and forgave treason as quickly as he forgave any other insult. His very basic life was that of a Buddhist monk, and he continued to live that life to the best of his ability in the strange world in which he found himself. So I think that we are fully justified in recognizing many of his attainments. But in order to understand this situation a little better, I have brought here something that will give us an idea of his attainments in language and related matters. Mrs. Langdon, in her book, Anna and the King of Siam, describes the red velvet letters of the king. Here is one of the red velvet letters. And it is addressed, it is written completely in English. It was written and signed on the 24th day of December, 1858, and to it is attached the gold seal of the king. And it was written to Sir John Bowring, governor of Hong Kong, about 3 years after Sir John had visited Siam to conclude an important government treaty with the king. Now, the place of Sir John Bowring in this is also interesting. He was an excellent selection on the part of the government to bring a good representative to the court of the king. Sir John himself was a literary man of unusual attainments. He had mastered a number of languages at a comparatively early age, and he was the author of one of the principal books on the kingdom and people of Siam, which he published after his visit there in 1855. This letter has bearing upon the book. We may also say of Sir John that his position was that, again, of a devout Christian in the court of a heathen. But at the same time, he was a very honorable man and did not fail to point out the virtues of the king's position. Sir John is remembered to us not only for his writings on Magyar poetry of Hungary and other similar patterns, but he was the author of the lyrics of 3 very famous Christian hymns. In the cross of Christ I glory, watchmen tell us of the night, and how sweetly flowed the gospel sound. These verses were written by Sir John Bowring. This is a letter to him from the King of Siam. The letter is in 19 pages in the king's autograph and carries 5 of the royal seals of Siam. The interesting parts of it, I think, show the naivete of the king and his peculiar difficulties with English. You will notice this little tag put on the end here, which is a sort of a little footnote, which bears the king's seal and initials. He has added it. P.S. Wherever I wrote in this letter the word smelling, it is my mistake in letter. Shall always be read smiling. Very sincerely yours, Maha Mongkut. Now, this is typical of the nature of his letter writing. One person said that there was never anyone that tossed the king's English around with greater abandon. That never for a moment did he permit grammar to interfere with sense. He was always understandable, but somewhat mysterious at times. The last paragraph of his letter will give you something of his English, which was derived partly from reading Chaucer, I suspect. He says here, I did have no time to write Your Excellency several days ago. For the aforesaid prevention, now I have therefore liberty to write, Your Excellency, as long as 19 pages in folio, on 5 papers, and beg to remain Your Excellency's good friend and faithful. Maha Mongkut, first King of Siam, who is in the 2417th day of his age. Oh, it couldn't be. It must be day of his reign. day of his reign. This is the way in which the writing comes. Remember the little story of Anna when she first met the King of Siam, and he pointed his finger at her rather accusingly and said sternly, "How old shall you be?" This was his English. But while it might not be too clear, it was not beyond understanding. Now the text of this letter is very interesting. It goes into a number of problems. Sir John Boring had sent him the first edition of his book on the history of Siam in 2 volumes, and asked the king to look it over and make any necessary corrections. The king, apparently, who had for several days not had time, finally gets around to writing this letter in reply, and also to acknowledge the arrival of a new British consul at Bangkok. And he says he is so happy that this new British consul, because he said, the British consul and his wife are so kind to me. You wouldn't exactly think that that would be a royal approach to the subject. But they have been so kind and gracious. And then the king goes on to explain that they have not made him feel ignorant. This is the peculiar thing that underlies the psychology of this man. That he loved anyone who did not make him feel ignorant. He said he didn't have to have anyone make him feel ignorant. He knew that himself. In this letter, the king writes back. He said, "I am carrying the whole weight of this government myself, and am busy for many long hours, every single day." He said, "There are so few of my people that can write English that I have to write all the international correspondence myself." And of course it would have been a joy for some of the state papers, undoubtedly, to come out in this quality of English. He said, I'm really embarrassed. I don't know what to do. And he said, what is more, I read your book, and I do not understand your English. I have to look up every word in my dictionary that is difficult. Then you transliterate Siamese names into English equivalents. I do not know whether they are right or not, and I do not always recognize them from the Siamese words. That I'm in a very difficult situation. And he said, there are so many things to do. If I do this, I would have to do it correctly and properly. And he said, it will take a tremendous amount of time. Because I'm just not a scholar in your language. I do not know your grammar. I do not know these things. I can get by, but when you are writing a book, it must be right. So it goes on for several pages in this tempo with considerable scientific and common sense behind it. Then the king says to him, but my dear friend, I cannot fail you. I cannot fail to do what I can. So he said, I have this to suggest. If you will pick from the consulate or from someplace a good English scholar who has fair knowledge of Siamese, and he will come, I will set aside 1 hour every day and give it to this man and go over with him page by page and paragraph by paragraph this entire book in 2 volumes for you. As soon as I can, I will do it all. If you will have one, I will give 1 hour a day to your book until it is finished. Well, you can see there is no great amount of arrogance in that attitude. It's the attitude of a man, as the king expressed it, I want the world to know us. I want them to realize our position, that we are what you call a backward people, that we live in the shadow of medievalism, but we're coming out. We're going to be sometime a strong, fine nation. And we're going to have friends all over the world, and we want them to know about us, and know about us correctly. And so for this purpose, this letter is concerned with the preparing of these notes and comments for the ambassador or governor of Hong Kong. This is typical of many similar letters. In every case, the king made a valiant effort to meet the requirements of friendship and to preserve the values. As a result of this, which was typical of his life in all of its different levels, the missionaries especially and the foreign representatives of state found themselves in a very awkward position. They found themselves loving this heathen. They found themselves admiring him profoundly, even though they could not convert him. It made a very interesting situation with a very conservative ministerial missionary group, for here was a man whom, according to their teachings, was a lost soul, and yet they loved him. They loved this lost soul. They experienced in him such a rightness of personal life that it became a considerable strain on them. It must have been quite a difficult situation. Finally, he turned on one occasion to Sir John Bowring and he said, let us not argue any more about the mysteries of the Godhead. I do not know. I do not know. I am not sure that you know. I am not sure that anyone knows. But this I recommend. You pray to your God to give peace and happiness to the people of Siam. And I will pray to my God to give peace and happiness to the people of Britain and all other nations. And thus we shall pray together for common happiness. And God, in his wisdom and mystery, whoever he be, let him bring peace and happiness to all his creatures through these prayers. That was a very simple and honorable attitude. So John Bowring went home with a great admiration for this man, and yet never forgetting the strangely bizarre elements, the almost comic opera elements that we find in the story of the king and I. Yet underneath it all, this searching man, this person tremendously deep in his determination to do things and do them well. Among other points of interest, it may be noted that it has been often said that Maha died as a pioneer and martyr of science. He was so deeply concerned with astronomy, which outside of the state and its problems was his greatest hobby. And it is unusual, as Bowring also points out, for a king, an absolute monarch, to have astronomy, mathematics, Latin, English, and trigonometry for hobbies. There was no need for it. All he had to do is wave his hand, and anything he wanted was there. But the one thing is, he said that he wanted that he could not gain by waving his hand was self-improvement. This he had to grow into by long and diligent labor. But he, by his own methods, which we have mentioned, calculated an important eclipse that was to be visible in Siam at a certain day. He sent learned papers and invitations to astronomers and scientists in many other countries. A number of them came and were richly entertained by the king, who then prepared a temporary summer residence in the area where this eclipse could best be studied. And he took all these scientists and members of his own court out into the jungle on elephants to reach the place where the observations of the eclipse were to be made. He had calculated it and, of course, was much excited over the entire situation. The eclipse occurred exactly at the moment he had calculated. And, of course, it was one of the great moments of his life, because in this way he had proved to a little degree that he was not a barbarian, that he could do things and do them correctly. Returning from this trip, he was stricken with fever, and coming to his palace, had the premonition that his end had come. At this time, Dr. Bradley called on him, and Bradley said to him, He said, I think I can cure this fever. And the king said, no, I don't think so. I don't think it is wise. He said, first, if I am cured at this time by a foreign physician, I do not think it will be good. It would not be good for the country. It would break down something that I'm trying desperately to build up, and that is respect in our own people for their own real attainments. He said, I think it is better not. I feel that actually the time has come for me. During his last illness, which was not of long duration, the king remained in full possession of his faculties to the end. He read considerably, particularly religious sutras, Buddhist sutras, some of which he had composed himself for the consolation of his own soul. He read, spoke, and conversed frequently in English to the very end. Sort of feeling in this way, perhaps, that he was showing that this language had really become an essential part of his life. He then gathered his court around him and nominated and appointed his young son, who was to succeed him as King Chulalongkorn. The boy was then less than 15 years old. Incidentally, Anna Leonowens was not in Siam at the time of the king's death, although it is indicated that she was in the picture. After having placed his affairs completely in order, King Mongkut addressed his people. Through his ministers and through his privy council. He told them in order to proclaim that they were not to regard this death as a misfortune. It was only an incident. It was only a changing of bodies in a long cycle that led to truth and immortality. That he passed on perfectly content with his lot, perfectly convinced that his destiny was in the keeping of an eternal truth. He asked only the consolation of hoping, while yet he lived, that the country that he served would grow as he had planned it to grow after he was gone. He then appointed a regent for his son, and after a very happy and pleasant communion with his family, he retired or was placed in his sick bed for the night, and everyone thought he was improving slightly. He passed in the night, thus bringing to an end one of the most pictorial careers in Asia. Instantly, the regent took over, and the regent, a venerable man, was a regent as he should have been. Things seemed to go differently there. This regent never for a moment had any personal ambitions. He took upon himself the devout task of building up and preparing the young king, Chulalongkorn, who was crowned as Rama V, for his work in state. Now, this young man's life was heavily influenced by a number of sources. In the story Anna and the King of Siam, it is assumed that this principal influence was Anna Leonowens. Actually, her stay in Siam was brief in comparison with the other influencing forces there. The great influence was undoubtedly exercised by the missionaries. For while they did not convert the souls of the Siamese people, they enlightened the mind of a great Siamese king. And through him, all of the work of the missionaries gained an extraordinary reward. Not in the saving of souls, but in the opening of eyes, in the creation of a new way of life for a people who have cherished that way of life and lived it very devoutly ever since. The regent helped in every way, was true to his charge, and when King Chulalongkorn came to the throne, one of the first of his official acts was his decree of universal religious tolerance. It had been enjoyed under his father, but now it became an official document of the state. And the young king said that it is good and proper that every man shall have the consolation of his faith. For it is observable that men without faith and without consolation are not, usually speaking, good men. It is also right and proper that every man shall seek his spiritual conviction according to his need and in any direction that may please him, that having found it he shall cling to it with every ounce of interior life that he possesses, valuing it above all treasures of the earth, inasmuch as it shall confer upon him interior security, that he shall not be asked, required, or expected to explain his faith, to defend his faith, or to strongly stand against the opposition of other faiths. A man's faith is his private strength. It is his right before God and nature. And therefore, King Chulalongkorn issued this proclamation, giving the right of all peoples within his kingdom to believe and to serve their beliefs as best spiritually suited them. His country was essentially Buddhistic, with some Hindu influence. The greatest single religious minority was Muslim, and is to this time. But all these faiths and religions shall live together in peace, because primarily the good duty and right of all faith is that men shall be good, and shall find peace, and shall find security of conscience and understanding. That the young prince, later King Chulalongkorn, gained this knowledge from the contact with his father cannot be denied. That his father was his inspiration, the young man constantly affirmed. King Chulalongkorn belonged to the modern world. He ruled for over 40 years, and before his death, Siam was a westernized nation. Industry, commerce, literature came in, and the king did many interesting things. And among the records of the Siamese government, we find so many important things. One will read, the great library of a certain Wat or temple has now been brought safely to Bangkok to become a state treasure. And it may be noted in passing, says the article, that this library was first assembled and placed under state protection by King Maha. Another record says, the great inscribed tablets on stone of the 13th century have been brought out of the jungle and placed in position to be preserved. Copies of them have been made and distributed, and now they are at Bangkok. The original excavation and the preservation of these monuments was due to the insight and foresight of Maha, King of Siam. The Museum of Siam was founded first as a private collection by Maha and was opened to the public as a public gallery under his son and grandson. Everywhere as you dig into the history of this country, this amazing king, in his pointed toe slippers and shaven head, stands out as being the force that achieved the transition between the old and the new. And the power behind this man was so different and so unique. A despot, yes, but a benevolent despot. A really brilliant man who never probably knew that he was brilliant, and who acted. He used to play at being great. He never knew that he was. He had these wonderful and affable qualities. And he never forgot those who served him and tried to help him. He carried on a wonderful correspondence. He followed the Civil War very carefully in the United States and sent many letters to Lincoln and other leaders expressing his understanding. He followed all the problems of nations, and he finally came to the conclusion that, as he expressed it, a strong nation is not one in which the king is strong, but one in which good government has made the people strong. Therefore, he said, I cannot at this time turn over my government to the people. They are not ready. But I am going to make them strong, so that in the future it will not be the king of Siam, but the people of Siam who rule. And this point was brought out in the restoration of the Constitution, by which the absolute power of the Siamese kings were in more recent years limited. And this Constitution was almost word for word the dream that Maha Mongkut had. So, after seeing the picture and studying these documents and papers, it seemed to me that this story was interesting enough to bring to you as an example of a little-known man who used philosophy and religion in a very practical way, and who blended great worldly power with a determination and resolution, as he says, to do good to my people. And this concept is not so different from the powerful people of today and their ambitions. And perhaps it would be well if more ambitious people of today would say to themselves, as he said to Bori, after all, I am a barbarian. All men who labor only for the advancement of physical things are barbarians. It is only those who labor wisely and lovingly for common good who truly become civilized. Well, our time is up, so I guess that's the best we can do it. Next Sunday morning, our discussion will be the self against the world. Is it really true that we have the world against us? There seems to be some question as to the fact of that, so we hope you'll all be here to see how we can get over having the world against us and begin to experience the possibility that the world is with us and the world is for us, and how we can build upon such a concept in the enriching of our personal psychology. I'd like to also call to your attention again our manuscript notes on the lecture, Energy Fields of the Human Body, which came onto the table for the first time last week. We ran out of copies at that time, but we have more this morning for you. I believe that the next lecture that will appear will be taken from another set of notes that has been very strongly asked for, namely, how to prepare for a fortunate rebirth will be the next lecture that will be placed in manuscript mimeograph form. Also on the table you will find this morning bus schedules. This seems perhaps to be very mysterious, but it's going to help you to find your way to our new headquarters if you're not acquainted with it. Because next Sunday morning will be I believe, we're not sure, we do all this with our fingers crossed, but it is our intent that next Sunday will be the last lecture that we give outside of our own auditorium, for the present at least. So we hope you'll all find out how to get there and all about it. And be sure to have your name on the mailing list so that we can give you the program of our summer activities. And we thank you for being with us this morning into a little jaunt into the land of Siam, and hope to see you again next Sunday morning when we try to work out philosophy for the folks at home.